sleep for because it's heavy and sturdy, you know.
Welcome everybody to the continuing series of monthly meetings of the Rhinebeck Historical Society. My name is Mike Frazier. I'm a board member of the Historical Society. And this meeting this evening, I'll be introducing our speaker, Stephen Mann, in just a moment. But it follows other programs that have been put on DVD and are available through the, takes a bit of time to edit them if they need to be edited, and if there are slides that need to be entered into the programs, we try to enter those, and then we make them available to the public through the Star Library. Normally it would be David Miller who's doing the introductions tonight, but he's busy behind the camera, and we didn't know that John was going to be able to make it tonight because he just got back from Hawaii yesterday. So we have two records of this evening's program, and hopefully it'll be available at Panda as well as at the Star Library.
David, the DVDs of James Chapman.
Great, good. So we'll give those to the Star. Fantastic. As I just mentioned, our lecturer this evening is going to be Stephen Mann, and Stephen may be familiar to some of you since he was the person who did, there are a couple seats up front here, Joan, and Steve did our walking tour of the Rhinebeck Cemetery, which I understand has been appearing repeatedly on Panda and is popular as a checkout from the Star Library. He's also, I understand, agreed to do a walking tour of the Württemberg Cemetery in June. Is that right, David? Mm-hmm. And we have a number of other programs between now and then, and we'll hope you'll have an opportunity to attend. Stephen's been a board member of the Museum of Rhinebeck History for a number of years, was the president of that organization, and currently continues as a board member as well as a curator for the museum. And in that role had put together the very popular exhibit on violets that was there earlier in the year at the museum. And it was largely the museum's collection that served as the material for the Sweet Violets DVD that was shown at the Star Library and was put together by Toby Carey. So if you haven't had an opportunity to see exhibits up there, you should stop by during the summer months when the museum is open to the public on Saturdays and Sundays between 2 and 4. In connection with that violet exhibit, Stephen had put together a more than just a booklet, fairly sizable publication on the history of violets in Dutchess County, and that's available for sale up at the museum. He also had worked as the acting director and president of the Dutchess County Historical Society, and his focus has been in the area of local genealogy. Stephen has done quite a bit of work in that area. He's also done quite a bit of work in the area of studying the history of slavery in the town of Rhinebeck. And when he did the tour of the cemetery, that was part of what he focused on there. This evening, he's going to focus on another area of local history, namely the history of the Quakers here in this region of the state. So, without any further ado, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening. Oh my God, a lot of people showed up. Usually I just wing this. I've done it so many times, but I figure tonight I'm going to structure it or else I'll go way too long. So who were the Quakers who came to America? Well, basically the Quakers are what is known as the Religious Society of Friends. And without getting too much into the religious part of it, It is quite different. Quakers believe that worship can best be accomplished in silence. There's a lot of personal meditation involved. The Quaker aim is to watch and wait in stillness and to seek earnestly for the love of God in their hearts. And the love of God, they believe, is found in one's heart. Let the worshiper be assured that the presence of love, that he will now be heard, press on in silent prayer to him. So basically it is meditation, similar in many ways to Buddhism and some of the Eastern religions and philosophy. The Quaker Way was founded by several men, including the noted George Fox. George Fox was born at Drayton, England in 1624 and was educated by his parents in the Episcopal style of worship. In 1647, Fox began ministering and traveled throughout England, often on foot, and refused any monetary compensation for his preaching. As early as 1655, the Friends services were held in Holland, and some services were held in Asia, Africa, and interestingly, the areas of Rome, Italy, the island of Malta, and Hungary. Around 1655, the first Quakers arrived in America at Boston, then Dorchester. In 1682, a large number of Quakers under William Penn came to Pennsylvania and founded that colony. At the same time, meetings were being held in North Carolina, Maryland, New York, Rhode Island, and the Boston area. Traditionally, the Society of Friends is strongly opposed to war in its conscription. The Quaker Way seeks to remove the causes of war, reconcile factions and nations, minister to suffering on both sides of the conflict, and help rebuild at war's end. It very much sounds like the United Nations to me. And witnesses creatively to the power of nonviolence and the movement towards social change, ergo the popularity of the Quaker movement during the Vietnam era of the 60s and 70s. For many generations, there have been what is known as the Fighting Quakers. Those Quakers bearing arms in every American war, and some young Friends in the late 1960s and early 70s accepted the draft. However, many declared themselves as conscientious objectors, and others as active draft resistors, refusing to apply to the draft. For years, the Quakers in America worked with such populations as American Indians, blacks, Mexican Americans, and other ethnic groups in the United States and Canada, and with indigenous peoples in Mexico, South America, and Africa. Many Quakers were and are part of the Peace Corps and the American Friends Service Committee. The main testimonies or ideals by which the Quakers judge themselves are equality, social justice, criminal justice, peace, stewardship, and integrity and simplicity. One late Quaker leader that many people have read about is Rufus Jones, whose dates are 1683 to 1948. He was a modern prophet who was brought up in a Quaker community up in Maine. For many years, Jones was professor of philosophy at the noted Haverford College in Haverford, Pennsylvania. He was a noted historian and authority on mystical religion. And I'll just say briefly, mystical religion to the Quakers was a very strong connection after the Civil War to the Universalist and Unitarian movement in America, which a lot of people are very surprised by that connection. Jones made a major contribution toward the ending of divisions amongst Quakers and toward creating the world community of Friends. Locally, the Hudson Valley had its own Quaker prophet. This man's name was Adna Heaton, whose dates were 1762 to 1827, of the Quaker community of Clintondale in southeastern Ulster County. Heaton was a medical physician who came from a long line of New England Congregationalists. He became noted as a scholar and abolitionist early on. He was considered a dandy, as he did not wear the traditional Quaker plain dress. He wore ruffled shirts and knee breeches. In other words, he was not a man to wear the simple way or live the simple way. He was, more interestingly, a Freemason, which I found a very interesting connection to the Quakers, and elder of the Plattekill Friends meeting in Ulster County. His papers and that of his family are kept at Haverford College, and his descendants still reside locally in Millbrook, Poughkeepsie, Wallkill, Highland, and they're still in Clintondale 6 generations later. So who were the local Mid-Hudson Quakers? The Quaker families of Dutchess and Ulster County primarily come from the colonies of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and more locally, the area of Southampton, Long Island. The older names in our communities include Angell, Carpenter, Cornell, Doty, Downing, and Frost. There are the 6 H's, as I call them: Halleck, Hartshorn, Heaton, Hicks, Hogue, and Hull. Mann, Palmer, Southwick, Sutton, Thorne, Underhill, and Wilbur. And interestingly, there's a whole lineage of Huguenot Quakers, including the families of Catant, DeGarmo, and Giroux from the New Rochelle area who moved up to the New Paltz area. Local Quaker settlements included 9 Partners and Mechanic, now part of the town of Washington, Stanfordville and Clinton Corners in Charlotte Precinct, Dover, also known as Oblong, Hyde Park, referred to as Crum Elbow, and Pauling, which is Quaker Hill and Oblong. There were 2 meetings in Pauling. Across the river, we still find the Quaker communities of Clintondale, Marlborough, Milton, New Paltz, Plattekill, and Tilson. As the Long Island and Westchester County Quaker families moved north between 1750 and 1770, they settled the fertile lands along what is now the Taconic Parkway. This likely was because most of the riverfront land had been claimed by the Dutch many years prior. The Cornells and Frosts settled at Crum Elbow. The Palmers, Suttons, Thorns, and Underhills claimed 9 Partners. The Angells, Hicks, Dotys, Downings, and Wilburs took Pleasant Valley and Clinton Corners. The Hulls settled at Stanford. The Hogues at the Oblong and Dover. Across the river, on the west side, the Hallecks and the Manns took Milton and Marlborough and founded Marlborough Friends monthly meeting. The Heatons remained at Clintondale in the town of Plattekill. The Catants settled at Tilson. The Giroux and Hartshorns settled and founded the Plattekill Friends meeting in Plattekill Valley. The DeGarmos claimed the little area of Butterville at the base of Mohonk. The Southwick family is one of the very few Quaker families in what is now the city of Poughkeepsie, and later they went to Wawarsing in Ulster County. The Southwicks were founders of the Poughkeepsie Friends meeting, which was then located on Lafayette Street, which is the parking lot where St. Joseph's Polish Church is. There were 2 meeting houses, actually, on that land. Many of the families who moved up to Dutchess and Ulster counties hailed also from Westchester County. The Chappaqua, Scarsdale, Purchase, and Amawalk Friends meetings were the largest in that area. The cemeteries have many of the same names as the 9 Partners burial ground out on Route 343 in Millbrook. The Suttons, Thorns, Underhills, Carpenters, Hates, and Palmers, all from Westchester County, also are in the Millbrook Cemetery, which I found very interesting, and I was able to do the lineages and prove that it is the same families going back to Chappaqua and Purchase. I am told that the grand old 9 Partners brick meeting house, which is still used in spring and summer by the Angell family and other local Quaker families for their own private Quaker meeting, held up to 1,000 people. It's hard to believe that that building had 1,000 people, but because of the upstairs tier, they were able to fit all of them. The smaller meeting houses at Stanford and Pine Plains had at most a couple hundred. Women had their own meeting. They did not meet with the men. And they had their own clerks of the meeting who took separate meeting minutes. Children who were born into Quaker families are referred to proudly as birthright Quakers. If you were married to a non-Quaker, you were considered written, quote-unquote, out of the meeting for marrying out. Sounds like the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Often, when the first child was born, the parents would write for re-entry into the Quaker meeting. And I tried to figure out why, and I was able to come to the conclusion that in many of these little communities that had these large Quaker meeting houses, the Quakers also held public office. They were town supervisors, town clerks, and most importantly, they were town trustees, because the old myth was you can always trust a Quaker. So the Quaker always held the kitty, basically, for the town and for the budget. In many areas such as Philadelphia, Princeton, and Baltimore, the Quakers also held in large numbers power in government. The structure of the traditional Quaker meeting is quite interesting. It's something I really wish to get into. The elders sit on a dais or elevated platform on small benches facing each other. The other members sit in simple wooden pews in front behind them. Members and women would enter through separate doors. Sounds like the old Poughkeepsie High School. Back in the 40s, the boys and girls always entered separate doors. Some meetings were held weekly, and I liked this. Other meetings, you only had to go to church once a month. I'm all for that. For instance, there were 2 Quaker houses of worship in Clinton Corners. One was the meeting house, considered the Hick site meeting, and the church across the street, which is now a private residence, was the Orthodox meeting. And I found, by doing some research, in other local communities like Clintondale and Stanfordville, it was tradition that the Hicksites took the meeting house. They basically kicked out the Orthodox, and the Orthodox usually were left with 1 or 2 little acres near the church, or near the meeting house, to build their meeting house, which they called a church. So, like in Clintondale, it's the Clintondale Friends Church. It has not been referred to as a meeting house since the 1830s. It's now a public library, actually, the little meeting house. The other thing that's great about the Quakers is the records that they keep. Anyone who has any Quaker blood can probably do their genealogy because the records were kept so well and they go back so far. Each meeting had a clerk, and that clerk took copious minutes of the meeting. The minutes were filed with what's called New York Yearly Meeting. The New York Yearly Meeting is basically a council that oversees all the little meetings in New York State. And those meeting minutes were then handed over to what was referred to as the New York Historical Society. Back in the 70s and early 80s, the New York Historical Society had some major financial problems. They basically were going to throw out the records. They would have been lost forever. And to the rescue came Swarthmore College, down in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, which is a very wealthy Quaker college. And what Swarthmore has done, they now have what's referred to as the American Quaker Records. They're all kept at Swarthmore College. And I know people that have gone down there to research, like the Thorne family from Millbrook, the Thorndale estate. They have paintings that the Thorne children did back in the 1820s and 1810s in Millbrook are housed at this library. It's an amazing collection, and almost every single meeting that ever existed in this country has some piece of history at that library. Unfortunately for us locally, the minutes of the Crum Elbow meeting were lost way back in like the 1820s. There was a fire in someone's house, and then all the meeting minutes burned. So that's what happens, you know. During the Revolutionary War, Dutchess County was quite unique in that 1/3 of its population was patriot, 1/3 was loyalist, and 1/3 was Quaker. Westchester County can also claim that. But even more so, Long Island. On Long Island and Westchester County, a lot of the wealthier Quaker families would pay for a replacement to go to war so that the Quaker did not have to go. And what's really great is that now the National Society of the Doors of American Revolution have recognized the families of who have paid for these replacements. It was now recognized as a nationally patriotic act to do that. And all these Quaker descendants now are eligible for DAR membership. And this probably explains why the DAR membership in Indiana, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, the real big Quaker states, their memberships have climbed. And I'm convinced it's because I know in 2 particular chapters in Indiana, outside of Indianapolis, they've gotten like 75 new members in the past 3 years. And most of them go back to Quaker patriots who paid for replacements to serve in the military. In Dutchess County, if one were to be interested in seeing a traditional Quaker cemetery, or an older section was now a larger cemetery with an original Quaker burial ground intact, it would be quite easy. Upton Lake Cemetery, the Nine Partners Burial Ground, and the Crum Elbow Burial Ground on Quaker Lane are 3 great examples. Actual separate Quaker burial grounds can still be found in Stanfordville and Clinton Corners. Many late 19th century Quaker graves can be found buried in the historic Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery as well. Historically, Quakers did not have tombstones. Tombstones were seen as a sign of vanity. However, as with their change in dress and other customs, things changed and the Quakers went the way of the fieldstone monuments and then the traditional marble gravestone. Still later, as seen in Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, such Quaker families as the Haights, Smileys, and DeGarmos have very large, elaborate headstones. For instance, the old Quaker burial ground in Poughkeepsie was paved over with permission of the elders of the Poughkeepsie Friends Meeting and was made into the playground for the Governor Clinton School. Where all that playground equipment is, that was the Quaker burial ground. The bodies were not removed, they were just paved right over. And they've actually done this in Philadelphia. They've expanded many, many years ago, well over 100 years ago. They expanded the big Quaker meeting in downtown Philadelphia. They just put the foundation right over the cemetery. They didn't remove any bodies. And so I've gone in there, and it is a very creepy feeling if you're there at night, because you know there's hundreds of people buried underneath where you're sitting. It's really quite interesting. The old section of the Crum Elbow Cemetery on Quaker Lane has the stones of the old Frost family. Barbara and Benson Frost's great-grandparents are buried out on Quaker Lane. But what's interesting, and this is from Barbara back in 2007 or 8, she told me, she remembers as a little girl, about 8 years old, Memorial Day, going to that cemetery on Quaker Lane with one of the great aunts, who was then in her 80s, driving an old Model T, and they went into the graveyard, and they saw over to the right are all these little simple, very, very short fieldstone markers, and there was a ZF for Zebulon Frost, and then his wife was next to him. But the aunt said, don't ever let anyone tell you they're buried here. They're buried on the outer wall of the Quaker meeting. The reason the stones were removed? Lawnmowers. And that's what's happened with a lot of the Quaker burial grounds. You can go to almost any Quaker burial ground on Long Island. You're going to know that those people are not buried there because the stones are all lined up. Quakers didn't line up their stones usually. If anything, they'd be one plot here, one plot here. It was really kind of a haphazard fashion for many of them. So who were some Rhinebeck Quakers, or at least people of Quaker lineage? That's what I'm sure many of you want to know. Well, many of the Quakers in Rhinebeck ended up in different churches in town. Yes, there is the Bull's Head Friends meeting out by the Taconic Parkway, and you should know that the original middle structure of that meeting house is the old Bull's Head Schoolhouse. The Bull's Head Schoolhouse was moved when the Taconic Parkway came in. They were smart enough to save the structure, and the Quakers took it and they added the wings to make their little Quaker meeting. In Milan, there were actually 3 meeting houses for the Quakers. There was the meeting house at Lafayetteville. There was the meeting house on Morehouse Lane near Tom Daly's house. And there was the historic Union Church down by the Milan Hollow Cemetery, which was torn down in the 1960s. The Lafayette burial ground is interesting. In the spring, before the foliage comes up, as you're going east and you're near the Lafayette house, if you look over the south side of the road, you'll see 5 or 6 tombstones. And the road paved right over the cemetery. The Quakers had no problem with that because to them, their spirit was alive no matter what fashion they were buried. So they really didn't care. And so I find that very interesting. In the spring, I always go looking for that. However, Rhinebeck's best-known Quaker family really was the Frost family from the Frost Memorial Fund. Barbara and Benson Frost's great-grandfather was a birthright Quaker from Frost Mills off of Hollow Road. And he married Barbara Traver from the Traver family in Wurtemberg. And they settled at Wurtemberg near her family. He became active with St. Paul's Wurtemberg Lutheran Church, as did his son Mandeville Frost and all of the Frost descendants. Zebulon Frost came from Long Island and settled at Crum Elbow and is buried with his wife at the burial ground at the Quaker Meeting House. Their ancestors, the Howlands and the Tilleys, came on the Mayflower. And that's something even after Barbara's death, I've been working on. We're trying to get a Frost family descendant accepted into the Mayflower Society. But interestingly, rather than to use their lineage from the Howlands and the Tilleys on the Frost side, somehow, apparently, Mrs. Frost was related. And they're trying to do it from the McRusty side of the family, which would basically say there were probably third or fourth cousins. But they're trying to do it through the more difficult side for some reason. Mandeville Frost became Rhinebeck Town Supervisor and was on the Dutchess County Board of Supervisors for many years. The Frost family lived on Frost Road, just off of Wurtemberg, and they had the large dairy farm. And in later years, Mandeville Frost grew violets. And the reason for the violets was to pay for his daughter's education. They all went to the New Paltz Normal School and were to be school teachers. Another Quaker family in Rhinebeck was the Cowles family, C-O-W-L-E-S. And this is another case like the Heatons of an old New England congregational family that becomes Quaker. The Quaker religion became very fashionable around the time of the Revolution and even before the Civil War. There were big growths in the Quaker memberships. The Cowles family is from Connecticut, and they're descended from the ancestors of General Hooker. Their tombstone in the Rhinebeck Cemetery is anything but simple. It goes by the name of Blythe, and it's a very high obelisk in grand Victorian fashion located behind the Adams Chapel. The Cowles brothers lived on South Street and ran a successful grocery store in the village. The Wakeman family is another local Quaker family, originally congregational, and they lived on Pratton Road, which is, as you're going east on 308, it's right across from Nancy Kelly's Sapasco farmhouse. The red barn is on the left, and the little, very short road with only 2 houses is on the right. The Wakemans were farmers who had the larger farmhouse with the pond in front on Pratton Road. The Wakemans were from Reading, Connecticut, in Fairfield County. Aaron Wakeman married Clarissa Morehouse, and he followed her family to Milan. Ergo, the Morehouse Wool Farm, Morehouse Road, it's all part of the same lineage. From Milan, they moved to Rhinebeck. However, even in Rhinebeck, they remain members of the Milan Union Church and are buried out in that graveyard. Dr. Elias DeGarmo was another local Quaker who was from Butterville in New Paltz. DeGarmo ran the private school on Livingston Street in Rhinebeck, just east of the current Third Lutheran Church. A photograph in the Rhinebeck Historical Society collection shows a very large, imposing brownstone building. He later opened a school in Fishkill and moved all of his operations down there. Rhinebeck resident Helen Reed, later Mrs. Theodore Delaporte, was not only educated at DeGarmo, she taught classics there as a young woman. While the school was not considered a Quaker school like the current Oakwood in Poughkeepsie, Dr. DeGarmo ran it pretty much using Quaker principles and philosophies. His nephew Smith DeGarmo was educated in Rhinebeck at the DeGarmo Institute and became one of the main principals of the Lucky Platt department store in Poughkeepsie. He is buried in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery with a very grand tombstone, while the earlier DeGarmos are buried at Crumelva. The next family is the Mann family of South Street and Center Street in the village of Rhinebeck. They are birthright Quakers whose grandparents were from Connecticut and Nantucket. George Alexander Mann married a fellow Quaker, Catherine Warden, from the town of Clinton. Mann served in the Civil War, is buried in Section A of the Rhinebeck Cemetery. He was Rhinebeck's fighting Quaker. His 3 cousins, Nehemiah Halleck Mann and the 2 Ketchum brothers, all from Milton, died in Virginia serving in the Civil War. 2 of them were killed on the battlefields, and the 3rd died in prison. The 3 cousins had been buried on the battlefields and were later removed to the Friends of Providence Quaker Cemetery on Route 9W in Milton, just north of the Ship's Lantern Inn. This is an Orthodox Quaker cemetery, and they were members of the Milton Orthodox Friends meeting. The Sipperly, Mann, and Briggs families of Rhinebeck are all my own distant cousins, I found out recently. At Marcella Briggs' funeral recently, actually, we spent half an hour talking about genealogy, and we all had the same information, so that was nice. Aaron Burr used to come to Rhinebeck quite often, and Burr had a lot of Quaker heritage. His headquarters were the Tannery, site of the newer Ruge building on Montgomery Street, or Tammany Hall, I guess I should say is his later name. He was a cousin of the Mann family. Burr's signature and Hamilton's signature can both be found in the Beekman Arms ledgers. It is assumed in the family history that Burr visited his cousins on Center Street in Rhinebeck and his Wakeman cousins on the east end of town. And we actually think that the house they tore down to make way for the police station was the old house that Aaron Burr used to visit. but information comes too late. I don't think I could have done anything about it, knowing that group. Another local Quaker family is the Collins family, who lived on the east end of Rhinebeck. The Collinses are descended from the Carpenters of Long Island and Chappaqua, and are cousins of the Manns, Ketchums, and Hallecks. The three Collins siblings were all educated at Oakwood Friends School in the early part of the 20th century. The Collins Library at Oakwood is named in their honor, and the Collins family plot is on the summit, on the very north end of the Rhinebeck Cemetery. The Cadbury family of Wynkoop Lane are among one of the oldest Philadelphia area Quaker families. Their family owned the Cadbury Chocolate Company. Several members of the family were educated at the prestigious Westtown Preparatory Friends School on the main line of Pennsylvania. Members of the Cadbury family had been active during the Vietnam War and the Conscientious Objector movement, and they were very active in New York Yearly Meeting. And finally, George Hull was a local character who was from a very long line of Quakers. He was a driving force behind the former Church of the Messiah Choral School, which was known nationally in the early part of the 20th century. George was a birthright Quaker who was a cousin of the same families on South and Center Street. He lived in the village and later built the large home on the southwestern corner of Bolenbecker Road and Route 308. He and his wife were interned in the urn garden at Rhinebeck Cemetery. That's basically my outline that I wanted to talk about some of the local names. I'll talk briefly about the whole idea of the abolition, because I think that's why a lot of people probably came tonight in the movement with the Quakers. One thing I have found out, the abolition movement, which was really more active on the Ulster County side of the river, particularly Milton, Marlborough, and Plattekill, because they had the entry into Newburgh, which was very active in the Underground Railroad. Abolition, as far as I can tell from a lot of research, for many years was not accepted by New York Yearly Meeting. And I found in a series of genealogical books on the Burling family, B-U-R-L-I-N-G, which were the Mann Halleck information I have came from, and the Carpenters and the Collinses were all related through the Burlings. It got so out of control, quote unquote, per the elders in the New York Yearly Meeting, that the Milton Orthodox and Hicksite meetings were taken over by New York Yearly Meeting for about 4 years. This was right before the Civil War started. New York Yearly Meeting, up to the start of the Civil War, had not accepted abolition as a Quaker-approved activity, at least in New York State. And there are people who have done research who will, argue this, but the Burling Books is a very well-respected series that a lot of scholars have been using, and it is the latest research that's been published on this particular section of the country focused on those families. And so there's one wonderful story that there was a slave who was being hidden in Milton, and it's actually at the old house. It's part of the Buttermilk Falls Spa, which people know about. It's a restaurant, very wonderful upscale place. In that stone house, the sheriff came to the door, and the sheriff at that point was a Huguenot ancestry, came to the door with a bounty hunter, and they were looking for this slave. And they knew the slave was seen in Milton, and they knew it was not up in the apple fields, it was down in the village. In the meantime, someone had alerted the Halleck family, who owned this house, that the bounty hunter was in town looking for this man. So by the time the bounty hunter got to the door, and of course the Hallecks let him in, they were cooperative, the slave had been dressed as a woman with her back turned facing a window, and she was doing dishes. So the bounty hunter, as the family lore goes in the Burling Books, asked Mr. Halleck and his son, "Have you seen this slave?" Now, it puts a real true Quaker would put in a very uncomfortable position. Quakers don't lie. They're really pretty strict. At least they used to be. And so he said, "There is no one of slavery or imprisonment in this house." and the bounty hunter and the sheriff left. And what was great, Mr. Halleck and his son were able to tell the truth, because the Quakers, at least in their eyes at that point, did not believe that any man should be enslaved, even though they were not pushing abolition as a religion. They were not advocating it. But because they truly believed that no man should be held in prison, they felt they were telling the truth and didn't lie. The story goes on that the slave made his way through the Underground Railroad system, up through Kinderhook, and did make it to Canada. Another local connection with slavery that I could mention, many of you who have been here a long time would remember the McKinnon family on Oak Street. And Ewan McKinnon, many of you know, was the son, and he died a few years ago. And the family has done a wonderful website on their genealogy. It's fantastic. I refer to it quite a bit. They're descended through Mrs. McKinnon by a slave, Joe Irvis. Now, I've found records on every site I could find to confirm this, including the church records. All the slave, Joe Irvis's children, were baptized at Upper Red Hook of St. John's Reformed Church. Joe Irvis was a slave who found his way up north through the Underground Railroad, went to Kinderhook, and got his freedom. The family's trying to trace if he got his freedom from western New York, where there were a lot of Quakers out by the Finger Lakes, or did he get his freedom by going further north through Saratoga and going up to Canada. They're not quite sure about that. But they do know that this gentleman, who probably Irvis somehow is a name he was given, probably after someone named Irving as a first name. He was able to come back to Dutchess County, and his ancestors, or his descendants I should say, still live in Dutchess County, in Staatsburg in the Millbrook area. But what I thought was so wonderful was that I was able to help them connect genealogically. All the cousins that I went to school with up in Catskill are related to them. This Joseph Irvis has about 500 descendants living, and almost all of them are in the Hudson Valley. And he was given his freedom through the Underground Railroad and the Quakers. Another thing I'd like to mention is the whole idea of Quaker education. I touched on it a little bit with the Garmo Institute. The Quaker education is very interesting. Until recently, and I'll take, for instance, Westtown Prep School, which is on the main line I mentioned briefly for the one family. Westtown, back in the 40s, they were still speaking the plain language. They were still using thee, thy, thine, all that. And they were going to meeting on Thursday, which was 4th night, and they'd go to meeting Sunday, which was 7th day. So they were even using the old calendar. And it's interesting, when you go to the old Quaker cemeteries and burial grounds, you find often the old graves, very rarely will you see May 3rd, 1901. You will see 5th month, 3rd day, 1901. They use, traditionally, up until about 1910, they were using the old dating system, and they were using the old language. So when you're going through Quaker records, you really have to know what they're telling you, because it took me a while to understand. I was looking at this tombstone. If I were to go back even further, with the old calendar, 5th month would have been July, because 1st month was March. So it gets very confusing when you're dealing with Quaker records. You really had to backtrack, and you had to double check. And the Quaker wedding, I should have brought the brochure. Quaker weddings are wonderful. We think of fancy weddings with a church, a minister, bridesmaids, and all of that, right? Quaker weddings, basically immediate family, brothers, sisters, grandparents if they're alive, parents, bride and groom, they come. Usually it's about 25 people, maybe 30. And they go to the meeting house, and there is an elder there, and you just sign a marriage certificate. There's this wonderful certificate that's written usually in a very beautiful calligraphic handwriting, and it's just the bride, the groom, they sign first, and then everyone signs the certificate. And a gentleman I know who's a Halleck descendant has the Halleck collection in his house over in Milton, and what he pulled out one day when I went to visit him was a collection of about 15 marriage certificates. And I was just floored by the overlapping. You could tell genealogically how they were related just by looking at the certificates. And he had in the dining room the family's oil portraits. Now this obviously would have been quite unusual for a Quaker to sit for a portrait. But these were what were referred to as Hicksites, or the fast Quakers. They weren't the Orthodox. The Hicksites were much more liberal, and they were much more willing to go with modern trends. And so, very interestingly, the same house that this man lives in is the second house on this property. It's on a cliff overlooking the Hudson River. It's opposite IBM and the incinerator. It's opposite Sandstock Road off of Route 9 in Poughkeepsie, on the south end of Poughkeepsie. And 7 generations of his family have gone to Oakwood Friends School. The last relative just graduated not too long ago, about 4 years. You look across the river, up the hill, what do you see? Oakwood Friends School from his house. And you look down the hill on his property, above the railroad tracks, you could still see kind of the outline of the foundation of the original house. What happened was, during the Civil War, there was an encampment on the Halleck Family Trust property, which is on Watson Avenue in Milton. And what happened was, these soldiers, Union soldiers, were encamped. They were local soldiers, probably from the 150th or 128th, on their property, and Mrs. Halleck wanted a grander house built. So these men were just sitting there. She hired them to build the house. They went from a simple little 3-bedroom, 2-story traditional Quaker house to a grand, I think it's 5-bedroom, colonial mansion, which is still there on Watson Avenue. It doesn't fit in with the rest of the village of Milton at all. It's the most beautiful thing. And inside this house is this collection of antiquities, ephemera, all related to this family that not only lived in the house, but even the generations before that came up from Southampton, Long Island. And there's even down by the railroad station, where they're redoing the little train station, there's a place they've been looking for years called Halleck's Rock that they can't find. It's kind of like the Plymouth Rock of Ulster County. It's where the first Quakers landed back in the 1750s. And it was the Halleck family. They came up from Long Island on a raft with all their possessions, and there were 12 or 13 kids. One had already been at Milton and was married into the Young's family, which is another big Quaker family that's still there in Milton, on this big raft. And they just landed at Halleck's Rock, went up the hill, and they went to this little Quaker cabin, or stone house. I'm not sure which of the 3 Halleck houses it was. But like 15 people, 16 people were living in a very tiny house, quite comfortably, which I find very interesting by today's standards. And I just think it's interesting. You find out these little stories by going to historical societies, like the Rhinebeck Historical Society, or going to the Platakill Historical Society. There's certain places around the area that tend to have this information. And it's very well hidden. And usually if you can't find something, you go to Swarthmore down in Pennsylvania. And the director there, Chris Densmore, will open a drawer. There will be a family sampler. There will be a family portrait. There will be family wedding certificates. All this stuff is somewhere. It's just like going through a needle in a haystack to find it. I mean, I've been looking, Brenda could tell you, what, 10 years, 8 years at least on Joan's Genealogy, doing her direct line, and we're still not done. And we just keep finding different things. And relatives, the Quakers have gotten so small in their membership in certain parts of the country, particularly New York State, they come out of the woodwork to find any distant relative who might have photos. I mean, we've had visitors for the whole family from all over the country, because my friend Celeste and her line, and we've been able to give scans of pictures, and they've been able to show us pictures that we didn't even know existed. So it's really kind of an interesting connection. When you're working on any Quaker history or Quaker community, the connections that come through. And often you find out, the Methodist minister who lives across the street from me, she said, oh yeah, my family's Quaker from Virginia. And I haven't even started to find out what the connection might be to Joan's family, because she's got so many lines going. But, you know, That's just what I want to say. Are there any questions for Mike pulls the plug on me? Thank you.
Actually, while you're... Come on back up, Stephen. I think we do have some questions.
Oh.
And while you're thinking of other questions, June 15th, I think, is the date that you are going to be doing the tour of the Wurtemberg
I think so,
Cemetery.
yeah.
Steve mentioned the Frost family and their moving to the Wurtemberg Lutheran Church, and it's that cemetery where a number of the Frosts are buried that Steve will be talking about. Somebody had a question?
Yes, I wanted to identify myself. I saw this listed as a history of Quakers in Rhinebeck, so I was astonished to hear myself mentioned as
I thought you were. Well, I was a little hesitant when I saw you come in. I was like, do I really go through with this part of it? I know who you are.
Who is she? Who are you?
I don't think she wants to be identified, but
I'm Mary Cadbury. I live on Rhinebeck Lane. But I've only lived in Rhinebeck since 1997.
right, I know.
So I'm
But
not part of the history.
my friend Joan Hall went to school with your sister-in-law Winnie. They went to Westtown together.
Interesting. Well, most of the people that you mentioned are no longer Quakers.
That is the interesting part.
Most of
Yes.
these families were not Quakers when they first moved here.
Well,
They had ancestors.
they had ancestors, or like I'm from Catskill, New York, and I found out most of the Quakers in Catskill, even though there was a meeting house across the river in Hudson, they all went to Christ Presbyterian Church. And they did associate themselves as Quakers, but because of geography, they went, and I'm finding that when in talking like with Barbara Frost, she's talking about her family, like at Wurtemberg, since her family settled at Wurtemberg, it was certainly politically the right thing for them to do, to join the Wurtemberg Lutheran Church. If they would have been the only Quaker family in that community, it probably would not have gone too well, particularly back then. But as soon as you walked in, I knew who you were, and I thought, oh God, do I go through with this?
We're glad you did. Don?
Steve, Union General Halleck, was he related to this Halleck family?
Yeah, I've done some of the research. There's 13 Halleck lines because of having so many children, but they all go back to John Halleck of Southampton, who came over about 1648 from England.
Another question, the Plattekill meeting, is there anything left of that?
The Plattekill meeting basically is going as Clintondale Friends Church.
The building.
The building down the valley. That's an interesting story. What Don McTurnan is referring to is there's this very beautiful meeting house down at Plattekill Valley, right off Route 32. And what's happened is there's an active cemetery that's still being used. The meeting house, which is really beautiful and quite large, for years the Giroux family from the Huguenot Society had taken care of it. The Giroux family's gotten very, very small in their membership. They can no longer take care of it. It's my understanding it was offered to Oakwood, who could not afford to move it. And the problem in moving it, as you know, it would lose its sacred space and any historic protection it has. There's also been talk amongst the history people in the county. There's a very beautiful meeting house out at Moore's Mills, which is out on the turnpike there. There's talk that that meeting house also is in danger of being moved and lost. They had a funeral back there in 2008 or 7. Mrs. Alley died at 99. That was the last service they had at that meeting house. They had her memorial service. The cemetery is not active anymore. I don't know what's going to happen in that meeting house. I have pictures up here. You know probably, Don, the Arthur'sburg meeting house, what was left of it is gone. But I do have some very important photos that were taken back in the 70s, which shows even back in the 70s the decay. Interestingly, one of the Rhinebeck families, the Wansers, were one of the biggest members of the Arthur'sburg Friends meeting. It's just that, again, by the time they got up to Rhinebeck, there was really no Quaker meeting settled. I can go through the Church of the Messiah directory over the years and find a lot of Quaker connections with their members and families. But as far as actually, like Ms. Cadbury said, practicing Quakers, not going to find them in Rhinebeck. I think on the whole you'd agree. I mean, there's really no, Bull's Head meeting has kind of gone by the wayside.
Oh,
It's,
come
no,
on.
is that still
I
active?
remember a Bull's Head meeting.
Because I hear from people at
Come and
Poughkeepsie.
see us.
Okay, because I hear from people at Poughkeepsie Friends meeting.
It's small, but.
It's small but
there.
still going. That's good to know. You
And
know.
we own the meeting house at Moore's Mills. That cemetery is still active, the Cemetery Association. The meeting house, we meet in once a year.
To
but-
keep it.
But we really would like to have another use for it.
So at least that information, you know, the information changes so quickly, and people go to Florida, and you don't get an update for a few months. So I appreciate that.
Stephen,
Yeah.
you've also got a lot of postcards.
Yeah, I mean, anyone that
Maybe
wants
you want
to
to say something about it.
look, this is a collection I put together really across the country, different meeting houses. I start with the local, and I move south. One of the things I pulled out, President Herbert Hoover, who was not one of our better presidents, but he was a Quaker. And he was from the Midwest. There's a picture of his meeting house. And what's great about so many of these meeting houses, the two doors, which was really important. Men entered one, women entered another. And there's a wonderful meeting house I don't have a postcard of, down at Smith Clove by Cornwall. That is probably, in my opinion, the most intact meeting house left. It's part of that little preservation down there. And the Smith family, which had connections to the old Central Hudson, they were part of that preservation down there in the valley. And they've done a really good job. But like Don has brought up, some of our meeting houses are in danger of being lost. And they don't, unfortunately, have the proper parentage or stewardship to save them. But it's a struggle. Once you move a meeting house or a religious house of worship, you lose your protection historically. You don't apply for grants, which was so smart of Crum Elbow. By not moving Crum Elbow, they were able to get a grant for that roof, and they raised the money to save the meeting house structurally. And that was really an important thing. It took those people a number of years to get it done, but they got it done. Pleasant Valley used to have a lovely little meeting house. That's not going by the way. You know, you go through Dutchess County, there were a meeting, some towns had 4 Quaker meeting houses. Out at Unionvale, there was a couple in that area. There were 2 in the town of LaGrange at one time. I mean, it just, Millbrook had 2 because of the Orthodox and the Hicksite split. And that really, some people would say, Elias Hicks from Pleasant Valley, some people would say, way back when, started the decline of the Quaker meeting by having that split. Other people would say it strengthened it, and it certainly did strengthen the Hicksite movement because their membership was way more usually than the Orthodox. The thing that turned me on about the Quaker meeting houses, their architecture is so plain and so beautiful and so pure. It's really a great example of American architecture. So that was kind of my premise for collecting the cards. And these are photos that were taken back in the 70s when they were doing a survey of Dutchess County meeting houses. A local family had a descendant, Dale Upton, from the Uptons of Upton Lake, and he did his thesis on the Quaker meeting houses in Dutchess County. He gave sets of these to different people in the community, and I happened upon a set. So that's all I need to say on that.
Any other questions? Don?
I'm friends with Del Upton. He's now teaching out at UCLA.
Right, he had been University of Virginia, wasn't he, at one time?
Yes,
Yeah.
he didn't like teaching there because he had to do a lot of administrative.
I bet he did.
But, he has that family had no connection with Upton Lake because his father came from Alabama.
Yes, but then he taught to Stephanie Morey, and I thought they worked on the genealogy and found some connections
I
up
don't
here.
know. I mean,
Yeah, the last I had heard, and that was a couple
he
years
He
ago.
did a paper when he was at Arlington High School, a fine paper.
Yeah, I mean, he's quite a brilliant scholar.
He's well published.
Yes, he is.
He's a very nice fellow. Very nice fellow.
He was probably one of the best professors UVA ever had. It was too bad they lost him.
Before I thank Stephen on behalf of everybody here, Mrs. Cadbury, is there anything else that you might want to share with us related
I want to
to
say a few things.
Quaker history here?
It's true that there were entrances for the men and women separately, but the meeting for worship was together. There was no division inside during the worship period. Then when it's time for business, then is when the
Split took place.
wooden curtains, as
Right.
they called it, came up, and we were separate for business sessions. And the other thing I'd like to speak on is a Quaker wedding. I've never heard of it being so small as you mentioned. My wedding was a Quaker wedding, and my husband and I entered together, and we stood and said our vows to one another, and then we signed the certificate, and then everybody there signed it, and it was a meeting for worship.
Really?
Yes, right.
Can I ask what meeting was that at? I'm curious.
Providence, Rhode Island.
Oh, okay.
And so the certificate that I did myself, it's my only example of calligraphy, my husband and I signed it right then, and then afterwards everybody else signed it. So there were 100 signatures at
Wow.
least.
Because a lot of the ones I've seen, and I've talked to some of the families, maybe it was just the way it was with their family, you know.
Could be.
We're very
It
small.
was a public meeting for worship.
That's interesting. I've never heard that up here, anyway, with a Quaker wedding.
It would be up here too.
Yeah.
My daughter was married at the Moores Mills.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful.
Any other final questions or comments? Stephen, on behalf of the Historical Society and everybody here, thank you very much for sharing some important information about an area that a lot of us know very little about.
I wish there was more to say about Quakers in Rhinebeck, but I can't find it. I've tried.
Thank you, Stephen. Our next meeting